Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Ask the Expert webinar. I am Annalise Barnett, Associate Marketing Manager here at BD, and today I am speaking with Curtis Egan, who is the Principal Quality Engineer at Certified Compliance Solutions Incorporated. But more importantly, Curtis is a 21 CFR Part 11 expert, and he has been in the industry for nearly 20 years, supporting pharmaceutical, diagnostic, and medical device companies with implementing solutions and systems for meeting 21 Part 11 compliance. So welcome, Curtis. Glad to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from you in this webinar. So let's get right into it. One of the interesting things I learned about 21 CFR Part 11 is that it was initiated by the industry. So can you talk a little bit about its background, what it is, and what it requires?
Sure. 21 CFR Part 11 covers electronic records and electronic signatures. And as you mentioned, it was requested by the industry pre-1997 when 21 CFR Part 11 was made a law. Industries had to jump through hoops to be able to use automated data generated to support the items that they needed to do to give information to the FDA. Mm-hmm. And they had to jump through hoops to prove that signatures matched the wet signatures that they use. So they asked the FDA to implement rules to allow them to use electronic records and electronic signatures. And that occurred, and as I mentioned, in 1997, it was implemented as law. And an important thing to understand is in the preamble of 21 CFR Part 11, it says you can use electronic signatures and electronic records, but it doesn't say you have to. So it's still up to the industry as to whether they apply it or not.
So if a company still wanted to keep their paper records, still do wet signatures, that would still be allowed by the regulation? Good. Okay, so you mentioned electronic records and electronic signatures. Can you talk about what the difference is and how the regulation kind of addresses those?
Sure. So start with electronic records. Electronic records is data generated by an automated system where you're going to maintain data integrity, and it's something that you would provide to the FDA in some sort of filing. For example, if we had a system where we were managing complaints electronically, there's what they call a predicate rule that says that complaints will be handled in a certain way, they'll be signed, they'll be approved, and they'll be maintained. That causes Part 11 to come into play. So if you have a system that's doing that for you, you have to align with 21 CFR Part 11 requirements for that system. So when we talk about a predicate rule for data, what it is if there's a rule that was in place prior to 1997 when Part 11 became law that said you have to maintain this data, you have to sign it, you have to prove that the data has maintained its integrity, and you have to report that to the FDA at some point, then that is a predicate rule that says Part 11 applies. If there's no predicate rule that's for that, then Part 11 doesn't apply, even if you are using a system to generate electronic data.
Okay. So the predicate rule is very interesting. So if I were a company and I'm interested in whether or not this regulation applies to me, how do I know about if the predicate rule applies? I guess.
And that's an excellent question. And what you really have to do is you have to rely on a regulatory expert to be able to help you to identify if there is a rule.
Right.
And a lot of times it will be pretty known. Like if you enter into a study, and the study is intended to be provided to the FDA, then if you're using a system to generate the data for that and to sign the records, electronically, then Part 11 has to apply. So you have to prove that you've met those requirements in order to use that system.
So you kind of mentioned this before, but where and for what types of companies would this regulation apply?
So the regulation would apply to companies in areas that the FDA has jurisdiction over, such as pharma, diagnostics, and medical device manufacturers.
Okay, good. So if we can get now into the meat of the regulation, can you talk about what are some of the key elements or some main things that a company would need to make sure that they cover at a minimum for Part 11 compliance?
Sure. One of the main things you'll have to prove is that you have security access to your system. You control access to the system to people who are authorized to use it. Okay. This would be typically a user ID and a password, and that user ID would be unique to two people. So if we had two people named John Doe, you would want to make sure that you could differentiate between one and the other to make sure that you can say who worked on what. So you need unique user IDs, unique combination user ID, name, and password.
I guess it matches to the uniqueness of a signature.
Yes.
So it should tie into that. Yeah.
And so you have to determine whether or not you're applying electronic signatures, because you can use electronic records and not apply electronic signatures.
Oh. Okay.
So 21 CFR Part 11, again, does not dictate that you must use electronic signatures or electronic records. So once you have the security controls, and you, one thing you'll need to identify is that you maintain a computer-generated date time-stamped audit trail for the data you're generating, the actions taken. And one thing to pay attention to is that you are not obscuring old data. For example, if you go and you create a record and you have a field and you enter data and it says, okay, the data is, the answer to this is 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right.
And you go and you later change that because you made a mistake and it's 1, 2, 3, 5. What they want to see in the audit trail is that 1, 2, 3, 4 is maintained, and that it shows that you changed it to 1, 2, 3, 5 at this date and this time.
Okay. So there's timestamp every time that the data is, I guess, manipulated or changed.
Yes.
And then a signature every time that happens. Okay.
And then what's important is you will have to validate the system that you're using the Part 11 controls for to prove that you meet the requirements of Part 11. So that is actually one of the first things mentioned in the actual regulation. If you look at it, 1110A talks about system validation to prove that you've met the requirements.
So you talked about security, making sure usernames and passwords, and then validation as well.
Right.
So I think those are the key things then that people need to make sure that whatever system they're using, there is some security control for the data, timestamps, for an audit trail, and then validation of the system.
Yes.
Okay.
And if you're applying electronic signatures, you have additional requirements of proving that the user ID and password equates to your signature. So in other words, you would be given permission to apply electronic password via the application you're using, and at which point they would have to ensure that Annalise, this combination of user ID and password equates to your signature. And then securing and protecting that record to ensure that then if I log in, I can't go in and modify it after you've signed it without that being documented and detailed and going back and requiring another signature.
Okay. So let's talk now about the system, right? That we would use, and I know, for instance, the software or any kind of system that a company might be using. And I know that some systems are open, some are closed. So can you just say what the difference is? What is an open system versus a closed system? What it means?
Sure. So it's all about data. So we're using a system to generate data, and we got a couple of quarters here. So let's say this is data.
Yeah.
If I have the data here and I close my hand, this is a closed system. I have control over this data. You would have a hard time getting to it.
And I wouldn't have control of accessing that data from you.
Now, this data, if I have my hand open and I give it to you, that's an open system. Yeah. So that's pretty simplistic. So in more detail, what it is if we have a system and we generate data and we maintain control of it for the whole time, that's a closed system. If, for example, we have a need to send it to a cloud-based application to have additional manipulation of the data done, we no longer have full control over that data. That's an open system. And so we would have to apply additional controls to that data. The FDA through 21 CFR Part 11 gives some examples of controls we can use, such as data encryption, digital signatures. But really, it's up to us to control and protect that data that we no longer have access or control over, so that when we get it back, we understand that that data is still valid, non-edited, it's non-adulterated, and we can use it.
Okay. So software plays a role in helping to meet these requirements. And so I think that, but I think it's fair to say that software doesn't cover everything, right?
Correct.
Right. So can you talk about maybe how software helps, and then what other procedural things a company might need to do?
And you actually touched on it. So portions of the regulation can be met through functionality of a software application. Those are the ones such as security access. You can implement software controls to provide security access. But there's other controls that are procedural that says your company will have a procedure for document control. That's something that the application can't help with. So there's specific procedural requirements in Part 11 that are not applicable to the software applications we're using. So when you're validating a system for Part 11 compliance, or more importantly, if we're a company and we're going to somebody and we're saying, hey, we need a system to meet this and it has to be Part 11 compliant, it's very difficult for an application manufacturer to say, our system grants Part 11 compliance, because there are procedural things that are outside the control of an application.
So what are some of those procedural or, I guess, action requirements?
1110C talks about you need to have backup and restore procedures. So in other words, we generate data. They want us to make sure that we have the ability to back it up. And if we have a disaster, we can recover it. It also talks about record retention. We have to know how long we have to maintain these records, because especially, say, in the diagnostics industry, such as you're in, a lot of times we have to maintain that information for a period of time, because it can be required to go back to maybe 5 years later.
Does it say what that time frame is?
So again, you would go to the predicate rule to determine what that time frame is.
I see. Okay.
We have password control. We have to have procedures that say, when I assign you a password, how long is that password valid for? How long, what are the characteristics of it? That is something that the FDA doesn't say. You have to have a password that's 8 characters long, has to have one unique symbol and a number.
Right.
But you come up with the procedure, and then you meet that.
Right. Okay.
Training, you have to train people to use the system. So there's different avenues like that are in the requirements, the regulation that have to be met outside of an application.
I see. So if we go, what about those security reporting procedures? So I know those are part of the procedural requirements of the regulation. Can you provide a little bit more detail on those?
Yeah, so the FDA is going to require a company using a system to meet Part 11 to have procedures to inform their employees what the importance of their signatures are, how to handle, let's say if you lose your password, you can't remember it, and you have a number of login attempts and it fails. The FDA is not going to tell you how many login attempts are going to fail or what exactly those security procedures are going to be. They're going to let you determine what is best for your company. But then when they come in, what they'll do is make sure that you're meeting those and that you have objective evidence that you validated that functionality within the system. So let's say we have a procedure that says we're going to require you to renew your password every 60 days. Have you validated that that actually occurs?
Okay.
You know, so something along that. Or do you have a system that's in place? IT, in a lot of companies, IT will have a system where it's just universal. After 30 days, 60 days, whatever their procedure is, the password's reset. So do you have the ability to prove that you've met your security procedures?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to software and open versus closed systems. Mm-hmm. I know that the Fact Suite software is part of the BD clinical flow cytometry solution is a closed system.
Yes.
And so as someone who is familiar with the Fact Suite software, can you talk about some of the features such as the audit trail or document control that help with Part 11 compliance?
Sure. So first of all, Fact Suite functionality allows you to set up users and to issue them passwords and user IDs. The user IDs have to be unique. In addition, it also allows you to set permission levels so that a user has access to do X, Y, Z. I believe off the top of my head, if I remember right, like we could set it up so that you could have access to get to work lists, and maybe I don't have that access. And that's an important functionality that meets the Part 11 requirements. It also allows us to use electronic records. So if we go through and we generate a work list and we run through, we execute that work list, we get a resulting report. We then have to sign those. And it has the functionality to apply electronic signatures requiring us to re-enter our user ID and password to install a time-stamped ID. So in other words, it would say, Annalise, at this date and this time, signed this record.
Right.
And so that locks it down so that if then later, if I have to come in and I have to reacquire information on that, it eliminates your signature because it's no longer the record that you approved, and it actually captures that in an audit trail. And it says, okay, at this time the signature was removed, it was recaptured. Then we go through the signature process again, so the audit trail just keeps growing. And I think Fact Suite does that in a very straightforward and well manner.
Okay, so I know that 21 CFR Part 11 can be very complicated for many people if you're just starting to get into it. Obviously, you've been doing this for years. So for medical device or diagnostic or pharmaceutical companies, if they're just getting a system that they need to make sure meets these requirements, what do they need to think about first?
Really doing the assessment. The first thing I would do is do the assessment and determine, is Part 11 even applicable? Because if Part 11 is not applicable, why worry about it? So I've actually seen companies in the industry go and buy a system to be Part 11 compliant, go through, start validating, realize that it doesn't have all the functionality needed to be Part 11 compliant, and actually start determining, well, do we have to go buy another new system? And Part 11 is not applicable. So first of all, make sure you're not wasting your time and efforts in determining, is Part 11 applicable? Then really, one of the nice things about the FDA, and I know we don't hear that a lot, is everything's available on the web. You know, we don't have to buy the regulations. They're public access. So go and look at Part 11 and identify what are the features we need. If we're just using electronic records, let's make sure we have the audit trail. Let's make sure we have the security. Let's make sure we meet all of those. If we're adding on the electronic signatures, let's make sure we have the elements, and we can ask them, we can ask the salespeople, if it's an expensive system such as you have, how do you meet these? How do you align with them? And do your due diligence up front. Make sure that the investment is the correct one. So once you determine Part 11 is applicable, do your due diligence, make sure that the system you're buying meets what you need.
And of course, the validation, which is speaks to that.
Right. So once we determine we're buying fax lyric, for example, and we bring it in, we set it up, we then need to validate it. Prior to us using it, we have to validate it and prove that it does what we intended it to do. And part of that would be that it meets the regulation. Because we'll need a documented objective evidence to provide to the FDA if they come in and they ask about that.
Okay, so we have quite a few frequently asked questions that, typically come up, and you've talked about some of them. But one of the first ones is regarding the audit trail. So if an audit trail can be turned off, does that mean that the system is no longer 21 CFR Part 11 compliant?
That's actually a good question, because a lot of systems are designed so that you can either activate or inactivate Part 11 goals. And just because we have the ability to inactivate a Part 11 control does not mean the system is not Part 11 compliant. Yeah. If we have it turned on and we leave it on, that system can be Part 11 compliant. It's when I decide I don't want to have to sign everything and I go in and I turn it off globally that it's no longer compliant.
Okay. So as long as it's on, you are meeting the requirement.
As long as it's on, we validated it for that intended use. We have the documented evidence to show it. We're meeting. So even if we have the functionality to turn it off, but it's on, we're aligning with the requirements.
So I think, why would someone or company decide to turn audit trail off? Under what circumstances?
Well, for example, if we have a company that does both clinical and research, they may not need those regulations to be in the research area. So they may be doing internal items that they're not going to report to the FDA. Okay. So Part 11 may not be applicable to what they're doing. So they may want to be able to turn it off to just save their laboratory people and their experts some effort.
I see. And then there's also the wet signatures would still be allowable. So maybe some labs who are maybe doing part, electronic part wet.
Yeah, and there's companies that actually do. They call that a hybrid system, where we use systems to generate the data. Then we print out the records, and so we get a nice paper record. Right. We go ahead and sign it, we date it, and we handle everything as if it was a paper record. And that's allowable in Part 11. Furthermore, they would then have the option, do we maintain the records, a bunch of filing cabinets, or do we scan them in and have that scanned record be the record of choice?
Right. It seems like having filing cabinets and paperwork would be a lot of work when you could do electronic signatures, but for some reason, maybe somebody might want to do that.
Well, smaller companies, sometimes they feel more secure doing it that way, or maybe they don't have the funding to do a lot of electronic systems and setup. So baby steps for them.
Okay. So I want to ask about electronic records. So
Sure.
is any kind of data that is generated on a computer considered an electronic record for Part 11?
No. As we talked about, you have to have a predicate rule that says these records, this data you're generating, is required to be provided to the FDA. Doesn't mean it's going to be provided by the FDA, but let's say you have a system where you're doing manufacturing and you're tracking non-conformances of product through a system. So you're generating data and you're manually inputting records and you're routing all the information electronically and having people sign off. That's clearly outlined in 21 CFR 820, which is the quality system regulation, that is required to be maintained. Those records are required to be provided to the FDA if they come on site for an inspection. Or maybe if there's a specific reason, they'll request it and you send them to them. So if you have a system doing that, Part 11 is compliant there. If we have a system where there's no predicate rule, nothing that the FDA would want, then there's no requirement for Part 11 to apply. And so that's part of why we want to do the assessment up front, determine what it is, because it can really change the functionality we look for in an electronic system as to whether Part 11 complies or not.
Okay, so I think that's...
That answer your question?
Yes, I think it's one of the frequently asked questions that people are wondering about. Another frequently asked question is, if the application allows internet access, should a digital signature and encryption be used?
That's a very good question. So this goes back to open and closed systems.
Yeah.
So if I have a closed system, you have an open system.
Yeah.
Even if I have internet access, but I maintain control over this data, there's no reason for me to apply digital signature encryption based on the regulation 21 CFR Part 11. Whereas if you are transmitting this data to your open system, you have to apply those controls. So it depends on how you're managing your data. Do you maintain control? Is your fist open or closed, or is your fist open?
Okay. And then, so one final question that often comes up is, if I log into a system with my username and password, which I think most people will do, then if I need to now sign off on a piece of electronic record, do I need to, again, do a username and password kind of control?
That's really a good question, because this is where I see a lot of issues in the industry. Because I've actually been to client sites where they've had systems that this is our Part 11 system, and they log in, but then they go to sign a record and there's no requirement for signature and password. And that does not meet the requirements of Part 11. So there's a requirement that you have security access to your system. And then there's another requirement that says when we issue an electronic signature, the first issuance of that signature will be with the full controls. User ID, password is the most common. So if you don't have that, if you can just sign it, then you're not aligning to the requirements of an electronic signature system for 21 CFR Part 11. And it's a common mistake that's made, and that's why part of the assessment has to be, how does the system align, and make sure that you're looking at elements like that.
Okay. So I think that I've learned a lot. There's been some very, very good things. I think one quick takeaway would be close your fist around your data and then really protect it. But what is one main thing that, someone should take away from our discussion today?
I would say that based on my experience in the industry, the big thing I would suggest is to make sure that you do validate your intended use of the system you get. Make sure it's validated within your environment, that you have that documented objective evidence, because If the FDA comes on site, and they do a site inspection, they could at any time request objective evidence that you've done that. And if you haven't done that, something as simple as validating your system to its intended use, that could be an observation which would be documented on a Form 483 that you would then have to respond, in writing and have a plan to correct it with the FDA. And you don't want to get caught up in that. So take the time and do your due diligence, get your documentation out of the way up front, and then you can use it, and you can be audit ready.
Yeah. Oh, okay, good. Audit ready. Well, thank you so much, Curtis.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
With us. I think there was very good information here on CFR Part 11. I learned a lot. Thank you for tuning in and listening, and see you next time on another Ask the Expert series.